Colleagues, we formed a quorum. I call the meeting to order. We have to confirm the minutes of our last meeting first. Any views, please? If not, the minutes are confirmed. Thank you. Information paper issued since the last meeting. I'm sure you have also read that submission. And if there are suggestions or views, we can take it up later. And please refer to our list of outstanding items for discussion. We've all got the list, right? I had a meeting with Mr. Matthew Cheung together with the Deputy Chairman and also the HAB to reflect members' views to them in relation to time arrangement. So, study on retirement protection in Hong Kong, amendments to the medical assessment for DA, and so extension of the PAS poverty lists or poverty post will be scheduled for our agenda at the next meeting, the 9th of December. In fact, even for the first item, we could go on forever. So why have we included 3 items in the agenda? Well, this is because we need to extend the PAS post for poverty alleviation, and also amendments to the medical assessment form for DA. We will just discuss the form itself, not the policy. So the first, or rather, extension of the post is from the administration. And second, well, I also like to take that up. Mr. Tan Kapil, to be followed by Dr. Fernando Zhou. Well, inevitably, when they discuss the medical assessment form for DA with us, we will press the administration on a review or reform of the policy. And I'd like to know when we can set up the subcommittee on study on retirement protection. We understand that Professor Vincent Chang is going to brief us on the findings of the report. However, we have to draw a line. Can we fix a date for meeting with deputations that have submitted plans to the study? And what about the $2 fare concession? When will it be extended to PLBs? Well, the transport panel thought that it was our term within our terms of reference. Anyway, we're willing to convene a meeting on any item that is even remotely linked with our terms of reference. And Ms. Sit Ho said that the subcommittee on light pollution is willing to give way to our subcommittee in March. Is willing to wrap up its work to give way. All right. Have I answered all your questions? $2 fare concession. Well, the list is so long. I could anticipate what you were going to say. We have such a long queue of outstanding items. I'm sure we are willing to discuss that. The question is, how should we set our priorities? Dr. Fernando Zhou. Amendments to the medical assessment form for DA. I'd like to know whether that's the conclusion of their review, or is it just a simple amendment to the form? If it's the conclusion of its review or reform, I don't think we can just touch on it lightly. Just amendment to the forms. All right. Can we have a paper on the amendments themselves? Noted. I think that is about amendment to the definition of 100% loss in workability. We don't want the scope to be too wide. Because is quite rare that the administration is willing to discuss with us. And in fact, when we fixed the agenda, when meeting with Mr. Zhang in November, we had a very difficult time. Now we want to pass the amended form first, but of course that is just subject to members' agreement. All right, if the amendment is to abolish the point about 100% loss in workability, that's okay. But for retirement protection, this item alone can take up the whole of our meeting. In last July, the SWD promised to amend the scope of assistance and promised to report back to the panel in 3 months' time. I'd like to know whether another meeting will be lined up for that, because 3 months have elapsed already. I agree. Dr. Zhang, you did stress this point at the last meeting. And when we discussed with the secretary, he said that the security panel was involved, or rather the security bureau was involved. So I'm willing to hold a joint panel meeting with the security panel, because we need the security bureau to agree to some of the proposals, and we also need the social welfare or the welfare bureau to approve these things. Because the security panel is involved, we must have a joint panel meeting with the security panel. So it should be in July next year. Because we already got 3 items in December, so it has to be in January anyway, unless, as suggested by Dr. Zhang, we convene a special meeting. We need the agreement of the security panel then. Chairman. Right. The assessment mechanism is under the security panel. The welfare aspect is under this. In last July, we had a meeting on this, and the SWD promised to conduct a review in 3 months' time, because for rent and food allowances, the level are so low that people can barely survive on that. If we drag it on until July, then many people will suffer in the interim. So I hope we can convene a meeting as soon as possible, because the administration promised to report to us in 3 months' time, so it should have been in October. It's already November. So can we have a special meeting in November? Deputy Chairman. I understand your point, Dr. Zhang. Can we demand the administration to give us a reply in writing as to what is its progress? I don't know whether I've read it in the newspaper or not. They have already relaxed the disbursement of rent allowance. Anyway, I have got this message somehow. So we should write to the administration telling it that it's already 3 months past, and it should give us a reply. If the reply is not satisfactory, we can line up a special meeting. Because if we can't include that in the December meeting, you don't want to wait until July, we must have a special meeting, a joint panel meeting with the security panel. So we will do 2 things at the same time. Well, the usual practice is when the administration has promised to report to us after a review, we will still have the chance to comment on these proposals. By the time the policy is implemented, we won't have time to give views. By that time, it's already too late. So the best option is to convene a meeting as soon as possible and let the administration have our comments and views for implementation. It has promised to change the mechanism, and we understand that the administration's view is finalized. So let's not drag our feet. Let's first ascertain from the administration whether the rumors were true or not, or the hearsay revisions were true or not. And I suggest that we have a special meeting with the security panel as soon as possible. We can have a shorter joint panel meeting.
Okay, we can ask the secretary when he comes in, because I have heard outside that he has no objection to that rent. The thing is, we need to bring two bureaus together. So I think we should just ask him. And that is, in what stage is that amendment? Because the promise was in March. And if that's the case, if you want to come as well, of course they have to come to us for any amendment. But we don't want that to stand in the way of scheduled items. I think we should not wait anymore, because we don't want to delay the change to that policy. All right, if we agree, that will be the way to do it. And then when we talk to the administration with regard to item 27, drug treatment and rehabilitation services, as you can see, there is a date attached to it. It was raised by Dr. K.K. Kwok, and we all agree that a special meeting would be held, and this is the date for the special meeting. Dr. Fernando Zheng, if indeed we can schedule the two items together in one meeting, I think there will still be time. In other words, drug treatment and also our improvement to services for refugees. I think the two can be taken up together instead of having yet another meeting in November, because we are all heavily burdened already. All right, if you do not disallow, I thank you for your agreement. Any other views, please? And if you have any views with regard to the dates we have reached together with the administration, we can reconsider it, including what Mr. Tan Ka-Piu said about the $2 fare level. Okay, thank you. So let us invite the administration to come in now. Thank you. We welcome the officials. We have Mr. Matthew Chung, the Secretary for Labour and Welfare, Deputy Secretary, and also another Deputy Secretary. We also have a Chief Social Security Officer as well as Senior Statistician. Welcome. I think this is the item on annual adjustment of the standard payment rates under the SSA and the CSSA, and issues relating to rent allowance under the CSSA scheme. In other words, rent is included in this item. Mr. Secretary, I hope you will introduce the paper, but before you do that, we'd like to ask you a question. We have some refugee status seekers in Hong Kong, and in July, the security panel and our panel had a joint meeting to talk about their dissatisfaction with a number of matters, including rent. And we have heard from the community that the administration is willing to increase the rental allowance. And you said that you would come back in 3 months, and that should have happened last month. So, Secretary, is it that you have already reached a policy decision? If yes, we have to take it up here. And actually, we don't want our meeting dates to stand in the way of your new policy, if any. Thank you, Chairman and members. Good morning. The answer was we promised to review it, and now we are actively working very hard on it. I hope we won't take long to make a decision and come back to you. The department is reviewing it. We promised that we would do it. Indeed, this was the promise made in the last meeting. We should not take long. I hope within 2-3 weeks. And once we have some news, we will let you know. 3 weeks? I dare not say 3 or 4, but within a month, we hope to be able to complete the review because we are working on it. Okay. In other words, yes, Dr. Fernando Zhang. Chairman, last time, the department and the bureau were both represented, and it was very clear that they said the review would take 3 months. As you said, Chairman, this should have been completed in October, but now the Secretary is saying he needs a few more weeks. I'd like to know the difficulties. There are 4,000 odd refugee status seekers in Hong Kong. They rely on the administration totally for survival because they cannot work. If we know that they are in difficulty, including seeking accommodation or with food and basic medical services, if they have met up with difficulties in all these aspects, we do have the responsibility to improve the situation ASAP. I don't know whether you can do it faster, because last time the promise was 3 months. Now it's already 4 months, and yet you are still not ready. What are the actual difficulties? And when do you think you can revert to the WSP? Secretary. Chairman, as I said, we are working at our level best to do it, and we have already promised to do it. I will take this up with the department for a better understanding when I go back. I will also personally urge them to come up with an actual recommendation so we can come back to you. Today is the 11th of November, and if you say 4 weeks, that means next month, is that right? I will try to do it as quickly as possible. The department has not ceased working on it ever since the last meeting. Chairman, I hope the Bureau and the department will expedite its work. If they still need a few more weeks, well, a line has to be drawn there. In December, either we have a special meeting in which we would invite the participation of security panel members. In fact, the Bureau has to come back with an answer not just on this item. So let us have a special meeting in December to formally take this up. I hope you can promise us that you would do this. 4 weeks, is that right? Secretary, you will let us know as soon as possible. Well, yes, after this meeting, I will personally attend to the matter, and we will try our very best to seek an understanding into the situation, and I will contact your clerk. And if indeed you will have a joint meeting with the security panel, we welcome it, because indeed this is a security matter. And the SWD is just the executive department. In fact, we are very happy to attend a joint meeting of the two panels together. Okay. All right. The clerk will follow up the matter with the security panel, I believe, by mid-December. Is that all right, Secretary? That will already be 4 months for you. In other words, Chairman, we have a special meeting in December. Well, yes, probably, but we have to gauge the view of the security panel first. Well, even if the security panel cannot find the time, we'll still have to have a meeting on our own. Okay, yes, we did that last time. Fine. The administration has already given us a paper on the issue. This is about funding and all Electrical members have been invited for this item. I'd like to remind you about ROP 83A, Declaration of Interest. 83A of our ROP states that at meetings of the Legislative Council, members must not move any motion or amendment to any motion or speak on any item if there are direct pecuniary interests involved, unless you declare that interest. So I'd like to remind members, if you have direct or indirect pecuniary interests related to the items under discussion, please declare the nature of such interest before the discussion takes place. This is cast quite widely. The item itself, so this is the reminder for you. Secretary, can you briefly take us through the paper? You have at most 4 minutes. Thank you. I will try to only give you the gist of the paper. This is the first meeting of the new session. This paper itself is about annual adjustment of SSA and CSSA payments. And this is a report on the latest progress. In 2013-2014, we expect the two issues to take up an expenditure of $40 billion. And compared to last year is an increase of quite a wide margin, and the total expenditure will be over $10 billion. So this is a great commitment in terms of government expenditure. With regard to SSA and also CSSA standard payment rates, we'd like to make use of the Social Security Assistance Index of Prices, which reflect the spending pattern of CSSA households. This is the SSAIP, to make sure that we preserve the purchasing power of the funding. As you can see, we know that there is room for upward adjustment of the different allowances until the end of September, because we start counting from October and we look at the moving average. In terms of standard rates and the OAA, they will be raised by 3.7%. This is the OAA, DA, and CSSA. As for the elderly, the OALA is started to come into effect in December last year, and therefore the adjustment cycle would be a little different from the other allowances. According to the FC's approved procedure, it has risen by 3.4% as at the end of September. As I said, this is only provisional. The OALA will follow the other allowances in its next cycle for adjustment. This is a special arrangement for this year only. The OALA is such that up till last Friday, there are already 404,300 elderly people who have applied for OALA. And also, this is not the final adjustment because we still lack the figures for October. Once we have the figures for October, we will go to FC next month, giving them the actual final figures. I believe there will be a small room for even more upward adjustment because we still see inflation. We believe at least 1.1 million people will enjoy the enhanced rate. As for the rental allowance, again, it is pegged to CPI private housing expenditure. This will reflect private rental for the lower income group. It has gone up by 14% in the last 2 years, and we believe starting from the 1st of February next year, we will adjust it upwards by 5.9%. This is the figure as at the end of September. And in Para 12, I'd like to draw your attention to the Community Care Fund, which has agreed to relaunch the assistance program entitled Subsidy for CSSA Recipients Living in Rented Private Housing, to provide a one-off payment to CSSA households living in private housing and paying a rent exceeding the MRA. This one-off subsidy will be $2,000 for one-person households or $4,000 for 2 or more person CSSA households. This will relieve their pressure from the cyclical increase in rent. This is my introduction, please. Thank you.
Members, well, Due to time constraints, we will have about 4 minutes each, okay? Mr. Tang Tapio. Thank you, Madam Chair. Of course, the focus will be on the MRA, in particular for 1P CSSA recipients. Well, even though you're going to increase it up to 1,525, what can you get with this amount? Just a coffin-like room, subdivided room. And as for the food allowance, less than $100 per day, I don't think you can spend that on 3 meals in all districts. So $1,000 for a coffin-like room. Well, you say that you can satisfy 48% of the recipients living in private housing. I'd like to know how many of them are 1P families. And you say that 22% of those living in residential institutions are also receiving RA. How many of them are living in private institutions? I don't think too many of them, because for the $4,000 odd won't be enough. So I'm sure many of us have just met people from Shek Chai Ling residential institution. Although they are private institutions, I think the Bureau should go on to a site visit with us, because 1,200 places will be lost, and how long will it take for you to re-provide that amount of places? All right, the director will answer the more practical issues. Mr. Feng, 1P family, we don't have the statistics with us now. We can supply it later. About 26,000 odd elders are living in private homes. On average, they are getting $6,759 from CSSA a month. So in general, CSSA should be able to cover the rent of private homes. What about, yes, their food? We're also concerned about that. The SWD has a system to deal with cases which are affected by redevelopment. If there are bought places, arrangements will be made, and then the department will also assist these elders to find alternative places in the neighborhood. Yes, we know that over 1,000 elders will be affected in that case. We've received invitations from individual members as regards a site visit. We've got one from Dr. Fernando Zhou, and if members are interested, we will see whether the panel would like to go on as a visit of the panel. Yes, we're all concerned about the welfare of the 1,000 odd elders, but the place would be affected by the NE development. It will be the town center of Kutong North in the future. I know many elders will be affected, and I know many legislators and political parties are concerned about that. Because item 3, you have to spend more than $60 million to build a home with 600 places. Now we're talking about 1,200 places. I don't know how much you have to spend in order to re-provision the places. Dr. Zhang and Cheng Hangpeng and DAB have expressed their concerns. So I will arrange for a site visit with members. Well, if members have no objection, then the panel can make arrangements on your behalf. I think it is worthwhile. I've met some of the elders. Many of them were received back from the mainland through us. All right. If members have no objection, and with the agreement of the secretary, we will arrange for a site visit as soon as possible, okay? Dr. Fernando Zhou. Thank you, Madam Chair. The poverty line has been announced. For those living below the poverty line, there are about 100,000 CSSA households. The CSSA is supposed to help the poor and to ensure that they don't have to live in poverty. However, among 200,000 odd CSSA households, about 100,000 of them are below the poverty line. So this is a wake-up call for us. We have to review the payment levels under CSSA. Are they already outdated? And if we just follow our past mechanism and consider the SSAIP and CPIA in making annual revisions, perhaps this mechanism is no longer effective. Of course, every year you just revise the rates according to these indices. But can these indices really reflect the situation? Take MRA as an example. Over half of the recipients do not receive enough subsidy under the MRA, and then they have to make up the shortfall with their other expenses. Well, in 1996, there was a review or a study of the CSSA, and then no study has been done ever since. So every year, the rates are adjusted according to either CPIA or SSAIP. I'd like to ask the administration whether it is willing to conduct another study, because it's been more than a decade. That's far too long ago. And also the problem of lagging behind. Inflation is quite serious. In fact, inflation of prices affecting the poor is particularly serious. So the revision will only make up for the shortfall because of inflation last year. After the revision, they will have to face inflation in the coming year. So how are you going to address this lag behind phenomenon? Thank you. It's true that even with the establishment of the poverty line, it's found that over 100,000 CSSA households are living under the poverty line. This is because we have adopted the concept of relative poverty. So this is understandable. CSSA is for meeting the basic needs of households. So I hope members understand. So we have done analysis. Over 90% of the CSSA recipients are living in PRH, 10% in private housing, compared with non-CSSA households living below the poverty line. They are already better off, or not so poor. So we're inclined to focus our resources and energy on non-CSSA recipients living in private accommodation. They are not receiving any welfare, and we like to focus on the working poor not receiving CSSA and living under the poverty line. But that doesn't mean that we will ignore the needs of CSSA recipients. We do care for them. Our view is that we should fine-tune our CSSA system, and we should focus on more worthy groups such as children and young people, because poverty is a very serious problem for children, and we will consider how we can help tertiary students to help them to move up the social ladder and to help children that are studying. And we should also encourage able-bodied CSSA recipients to work. So next April, we will have a work incentive scheme for able-bodied CSSA recipients. For those who make more than who make over that benchmark of $2,500, they can keep the surplus savings. Well, both of my questions not been answered. Okay, please wait for your second turn. Deputy Chairman, first I agree with Dr. Fernando Zheng. The revisions have lagged behind the inflation, so I suggest after standard payments, you should have an amount for inflation. It can be a floating level, floating on a quarterly basis, and you can help them so that, well, when inflation is high, they get that revised rate. But when the inflation when inflation has eased, they don't need it anymore. So in addition to the standard payments, can there be a varying inflation related rate? So you don't have to change the standard rates. And we'd like to seek some information from the SWD. There are about 17,000 to 18,000 households living in private accommodation, and they are paying rent higher than your MRA. Can you give us a table on the number of 1P, 2P households all the way up to 6P households? And the extent in terms of percentage of exceedance, so that we can tell whether the $2,000 or $4,000 for under CCF are really helping the 17,000 to 18,000 households living in private accommodation. And Annex 1 and 2, I don't like your presentation. A number of eligible members in a household, once it is 6 or above, you will the average monthly CSS payment will flat out. I don't think this is a wrong calculation, but I think you are misleading the public. People will be misled into thinking that a 1P household can get $4,848 per month plus rent assistance. This is not the case. You have also taken into account other annual supplements. So people will be misled into thinking that a 1P household can get over $6,000 per month. So this is not correct. Please change your presentation so that members of the public know how much a household is getting per month as well as per year. Secretary, you have less than 1 minute to respond because the queue is long. So please be very concise. All right, I'll be very concise. First, that lag behind arrangement. Well, in 1999, before 1999, we more or less use the concept of projected or expected inflation. But then if it was over the overestimation, then we might have to recover the excess amount. No, it is very different. Please don't forget that in 2008, inflation was high, and then we made an additional revision before time. So please bear in mind that we don't always wait for the 12-month cycle. In 2008, we added 1.4% during that 12-month period. That's extra. All right. Mr. Leung Kwok Hong, this concept of spending before you have actually made the income is something for the rich only. For instance, Secretary, do you remember that when you first started work, there's the system of petty cash? What for? For buying stationery, for traffic expenses, so that you don't have to take money out of your pocket. It's unreasonable for employees to pay out of pocket for the employers first. So does the administration or large businesses have this system? If yes, why can't you apply the same to CSSA recipients? You may think that it is very difficult to recover, that you should do it on a quarterly basis so that your loss can be contained. And even if people cheat you, it will be up to a certain limit. So what kind of a person are you? You use a special system to tackle the poorest. For instance, for my assistants, I give them $10,000 or $15,000 as petty cash, and if the employee resigns, I will then work out the accounts and ask for the balance.
Now you say the poor might cheat you, and Peter Chen Kwok-chi has asked you to do it on a 3-month cycle basis, but you say no. So why do you do away with the petty cash system? You have to explain it. Secondly, rental. I have told you many times, but you are not willing to implement rent control. I asked you how long to implement rent control. He refused flatly. Now, you make use of public money to subsidize those people who operate coffin spaces. I don't want to see that done. But if we have rent control, then you can help the needy. You are not willing to do it, and now you come to whine to say that rentals have gone up by a wide margin. I really think that you are quite useless. You always say we cannot give too much rent allowance or else we cannot control expenditure. Go back and use your brain, please. Whenever we make proposals to you, you refuse, and yet what you think does not work. Now, those who are on CSSA, half of them are still poor households. So why do you have the CSSA? I'd like to know what measures you can have to save the poor households under CSSA. Let me talk to you as a technocrat. Let us not appeal to your sympathy. Now that you have discovered this problem, those who are on CSSA and yet are still poor, those poor households on CSSA, how can you help them? Don't always say this is well established or time-honored. Don't just talk about what has already been done. What good measures do you have under the CSSA? How can you help the poor households who are already on CSSA? Ms. Chan, please ask him the question. If they don't have any good ideas, go back home to sleep. This is a social phenomenon you have created. I don't need him to answer me. Someone should jump into the sea. Okay, Secretary, you don't need to answer. Mr. Pun Xiu Peng. Thank you, Chairman. I'd like to look at the information on MRA. I'm also interested in what Peter Chen Kwok-chi said. There are about 230,000 people applying for rental and who are under CSSA, and those living in private housing, 34,000. Just now, the Secretary said that the CCF launched a rental assistance scheme to people renting private housing in 2011. He said this would continue. I'd like to ask a few questions. Actually, you already have the data. Why can't you regard this as a standard expenditure? And also, how can you provide more concrete information so we can have more data on our hands? How much are these people living in private housing still paying out of their own pocket after getting the rental assistance from CCF? We need that kind of data so we can help them solve the problem later. Secretary, can you have more concrete information for us? Secretary, I'd like to defer to Mr. Fong to see whether he has concrete information. But basically, I'd like to say that the CCF has enhanced the subsistence. It was 1,000 for one person or 2,000 for 2 or more persons. But now it has been doubled, 2,000 for 1P family and then 4,000 for 2 or more persons households. We hope that this can relieve the pressure that has been brought by cyclical rent increase. Secondly, as I said last time, we have to be cautious about one thing. If the rent allowance can satisfy the entire demand, then those who are not on CSSA but who are living in private housing will also face higher rent. So to non-CSSA households in private housing, this would mean a vicious cycle because the owners will put up the rent. We have to be careful about the macro situation. So on the one hand, we have this mechanism to adjust it every year. It is now 5.9%, but I said there would be a slight increase after the October figures are known. And then together with the CCF, which provides some relief, in the long term, Mr. Poon, we have to increase the supply of PRH. That would be the way to eradicate the problem, because the basic problem is that people are not living in PRH. Mr. Feng, do you have more concrete information? As Mr. Peter Chiang Kwok-chi said, he would like to have the same information. That is the rent differential and also how many people are involved. We will supply that after the meeting. Okay, next one. Mr. Chen Han Pan. Thank you, Chairman. Actually, we have always been asking for more data from the administration. Now I will detail my request. Number one, there are 48% of CSSA households living in private housing. How much rent allowance are you giving these people to pay rent, and what is the rent differential they have to pay out of their own pocket, and how many people are involved? Secondly, the CCF has paid out this one-off payment. How many households, as a result, did not have to pay rent out of the CSSA allowance? So how many people have you helped? Number three, when the rent allowance is hiked by a certain percentage, how many households in private housing do not have to pay any rent differential from their standard payments of CSSA? Now, of course, we know that if you allow people to claim reimbursement for rent without any restriction, then those who are not on CSSA may have to face higher rent. But then we still need to know how many CSSA households still have to pay a rent differential after receiving rent allowance from the CSSA standard payment, and how then is their livelihood impacted upon. Can we have the data, please? I defer to Mr. Feng. Director, I will answer briefly. Without counting the upward adjustment that will come into effect in February and without regarding the CCF payment, there are now about a certain number of people who are paying rent at the level of the allowance or lower than that allowance. These people account for 48%, but with a 5.9% increase in rent allowance, the number will go up to 60%. Together with CCF, the number will stand at 68%. In other words, there are still 30-odd% who still have to make use of their CSSA payment in order to pay the rent differential. Can I say that? Yes. Now, what is the rent differential that they are paying? For example, is it that the entire MRA is used up and then they still have to use the entire CSSA standard payment to pay rent? If that's the case, what about their livelihood? Every month they come with a rental receipt to claim the allowance. So you should have the data. Can you tell me then how much they are paying out of the standard livelihood supplement to pay rent? Is it $500 or $1,000? I have to do that after the meeting, please. Okay, thank you. Mr. Leung Yu-chung. Chairman, I think we are quite concerted in our questions, and that is how you can catch up with inflation because you now lag behind the inflation cycle, and secondly, rent allowance. I am also interested in these two matters. Secretary, you said just now that in 2008, you did a half-yearly review. That was a special exercise. Chairman, the Secretary always said that he would exercise flexibility. However, you always would have to come back to us and you would take time to approve applications. That would at least take 2 months. And that means a lot to CSSA households because they're always facing pressure. I'd like you to really think about more flexibility, as Peter Cheung Kok Chi was saying. Even if you attend to this with urgency, you still have to spend time with this council and go back to approve the applications, unless you don't come back to the panel. Or else, you cannot solve this problem of a lag after inflation has already taken place. So can you think of a way to try to catch up with inflation quicker? Secondly, rent allowance. We know that there are single-parent households with CSSA, but the rent allowance is only for half of the household. In other words, you don't regard them as a 2P family, but only a 1P family in giving the rent allowance. You know, it's so hard on single-parent families. They only have one CSSA standard payment for one person in order to also look after the child, and just half of the MRA. Can you please try to help them? Because you cannot pay half rent to the landlord, even if the rent assistance is just 50%. So can you please think about this and what you can do, Secretary? First question, I'd like to reiterate, as I answered Cheung Kok Chi about this lag, you know the historical background. In 2009, before 2009, we did predictions, but now it's no longer feasible to do it. And if necessary, like in 2008, there was continuous inflation, we will exercise flexibility, we will keep watch of the situation, and we'll try our very best to help the CSSA households. That's our principle. Mr. Fong, you can talk about the single-parent families. I think Mr. Leung Yiu-chung is talking about single-parent families whereby the father or mother is not eligible for CSSA. So CSSA is only paid for the child. These are ineligible people who are the parents. No, Chairman. The landlord does not accept half rent, but the rental assistance is only at 50%. They live in a room, but you only allow them to get half of the rent assistance. I think you should think about the system. Okay, the parent may not be eligible for CSSA, but the child also lives in that room together and he or she has to pay rent. Why do you only give the MRA at 50%? Chairman, we pay out rent assistance according to the eligible number of people in the household. Well, then are you going to tell the landlords to accept half rent? This is not possible. Well, you give out the payment for one person, but it is for 2 persons. This is the objective reality. Mr. Albert Ho, Chairman. Just now, the Secretary said that if you are ineligible, you cannot get CSSA, and therefore CSSA is only for eligible people in the household. The problem is the person who has to face the consequence is not the person who cannot get CSSA. Very often the parent is not eligible, but the parent has to take care of the child who is eligible for CSSA, but the parent is spending the payment for the child. And comparatively, we should satisfy the basic needs of the child in calculating CSSA payments. However, the parent has to take care of the child, but there is no money to spend for his or her own livelihood, so the money for the child is also used by the parent. However, if you are concerned about the basic needs of the child, you should look harder at the problem. I understand this is controversial, but the problem is those who have settled in Hong Kong, they are Hong Kong people, and they are taking care of children with the right of abode in Hong Kong. So you should be pragmatic. You, of course, can say that if you want to stay in the kitchen, you have to stand the heat. However, in reality, the child is deprived of the money for maintaining basic living.
So I'm most concerned about this issue. 7 years is far too long, and the administration must review this rule. We should not impose this policy on someone who is already a Hong Kong resident. And your payments are not related to the poverty line at all. You keep saying relative poverty, but if you have a poverty line or you have a CSSA, there is no regard to the poverty line, or there is no objective to lower the population of people below the poverty line. What's the good of having this system? And it is the common expectation of society for you to lower the population of people living in the poverty line. Now, if you have a relative poverty concept, that means it is the government's long-term objective to keep someone who are always relatively poor. Is it a reasonable policy? Secretary. All right. Single parent or a single parent poverty, or with one of the parents not being a Hong Kong permanent resident or not eligible yet. Well, as we said, the poverty line is not a poverty alleviation line. We first have the concept of relative poverty, and secondly, we give no regard to assets. So, for poverty among the elders, perhaps the population might be overestimated because using the poverty line, there are 290,000 poor elders, but according to Census and Statistics Department, 140,000 of them do not have any financial problems. So this is one demerit of adopting the poverty line. We know that it is far from ideal, but it is an internationally adopted practice. However, for those that are genuinely needy, we will certainly help them. So we start with the working poor. We encourage self-reliance, and we also focus on the 500,000 of people who are in working poor families. Thank you. Mr. Leung Chi-Chang, to be followed by Mr. Raymond Wong. Mr. Leung Chi-Chang. Thank you. I'd like to follow up on Mr. Chang Han-Peng's questions. CSSA recipient living in private housing, and if your MLA is insufficient to cover their rent, according to the administration, if we take into account subsidy under the CCF, 68% of them will see the rental problem resolved, and we still have close to 30,000 households who have a problem. If they cannot cover rent, they will have to use the allowances for other basic commodities. For instance, they will take it from their food expenses. So for these people, they have no protection at all. We don't know how much they are using their money on food for rent subsidy, for instance. So can the director conduct a survey on these close to 30,000 households? How much more are they paying in order to make up for the shortfall from MLA? Because we're worried that high rent might erode into their expenses for daily expenses, and children will be severely affected. So can you conduct a survey to find out whether they face serious problems causing hardship? And we're all concerned about single-parent families where that single parent has not satisfied the 7-year rule. Now, you are not going to pay to account that parent eligible for rent assistance. So I'd like to know how many such households we have in Hong Kong, because the children will be affected because the household doesn't have enough money to spend. The child's payments will be spent on living expenses of 2 persons. This policy sounds too rigid. I understand that sometimes the SWD will exercise discretion, but I'd like to know how many discretion cases do you have, for instance, in terms of the total number of such cases you have. Mr. Fung, 3 questions. We might not be able to provide the statistics at once. So what about the 32% households who will not have enough to cover their rent? We know that these are matters close to the heart of members. Please allow some time to collate the figures. Mr. Fung, can you please supplement on the question involving the 7-year rule? We are at a dilemma. The welfare district officers will of course exercise discretion, and sometimes our food banks can also offer assistance flexibly, and we want our policy to be clear-cut so as to avoid abuse. However, we will try to be flexible as far as possible on the basis of the merits of each case. Deputy Director, please. Yes, I'll be very quick. Regarding the question on rent assistance, there are 35,498 cases living in private housing. Taking into account the revision and subsidy from CCF, 68% of them have sufficient rent allowances to meet their rents. They're about 23,673. So less than 31%. So it's about 10,900 odd cases, not 30,000 cases as claimed by Mr. Leung. For details, we will provide them after the meeting. Regarding the 7-year rule, Mr. Leung is very correct. The director has discretionary power to approve CSSA for these cases. Some statistics starting from 2004, when the 7-year rule was put in place, to end of September 2013, we've approved 14,000 cases. But we are talking about people on a 2-way permit. If we talk about people on 2-way permit and are not Hong Kong residents yet, we cannot exercise discretion at all. Mr. KK Fong, a few comments and also some questions. The administration claims that the concept is relative poverty. What about the CSSA line? Perhaps it is aligned to define absolute poverty. Well, CSSA standards are set by you. Can you fix it to coincide with the poverty line? What if you move your CSSA payment rates to tie in with the 1/2 of the median household income? What will be the extra financial implications to the government? And but of course, CSSA, you take into account both income and assets, whereas for the poverty line, you disregard assets. So I think the figure for CSSA should be smaller. So do you have any information? I suggest that you align the CSSA line with the poverty line. And for those who are regarded as poor, if taking into account the asset they have, they still have means over the CSSA line, then they are not eligible for CSSA at all. And I want you to split the statistics for PRH and private housing. So the current MRA should apply to PRH recipients only, and you have a separate MRA for private housing, and it should be adjusted according to the increase in rent index. Because in the past few years, PRH rentals have not risen too much, but not so for the rents of private housing. We're worried that your current treatment would favor PRH residents and not those living in private housing. So I'm suggesting a different rent index for people living in PRH and private housing respectively. And you just told us that about 30,000 odd households will have to make up for the shortfall in rent allowance from their money for food. Do you know that for CSSA recipients living in private housing, well, they are living in underprovided housing because, for instance, for a 3P family, because they cannot afford proper housing for that family size, they have to go for housing suitable for 2P families only. So I hope the administration will address these problems. Secretary. Yes, I will reply concisely. Yes, we'll first work out the financial implications if we align the CSSA line and the poverty line. Secondly, Mr. Fung asked whether we can have two separate mechanisms for calculating MRA for PRH and private housing CSSA recipients respectively. In fact, CPIA is the movement of private housing rental. So CPIA represents the expenses of grassroots. So we're already doing that. And Mr. Fung, please address the third question. Households living in underprovided housing. Well, we provide MRI on the basis of number of eligible members in a household. So households are free to choose where they want to live on the basis of the payment they receive. All right. We have overrun by a few minutes already. I think I have to draw a line now. Mr. KK Fung, second round, we have 3 members. I read out the names now. Tenka, Pio, Fernando Zhang, KK Fung. The chairman said 1 minute each. Well, we've overrun by 20 minutes already. If you want more time, we have to extend our meeting. Stand up here 1 minute. I'm very concerned about rent assistance for 1P household. Just $3,000 odd per month. I fail to see how they can make up for that shortfall from money for food. And even so, they can only rent coffin spaces. If you say this is reasonable, it is unimaginable. Do you know how many 1P or a singleton CSSA recipients are living in coffin spaces? If you don't have the figure now, let us know later. Do you know the distribution of different types of private housing among singleton CSSA recipients? Yes, we can provide information on 1P or singleton CSSA recipients. As regards how many of them are living in SDUs or coffin spaces, well, we really have to check. Please supply the information later. Mr. KK Fong, am I coming through? All right. Please start the timer anew. Yes, please proceed. I think I've complained many times against the rent index. That index is applied across the territory, even for PRH. Well, for PRH, you also have the extended urban area and also the NT areas. So you should apply the same. And even for 1P PRH unit, the size is 70 meter squares, that is 190 square foot. So with that $3,000, will a singleton be able to rent the flat of the same size in private housing? The answer is no.
Secretary, we are quite willing to go back and explore the issue to see whether there are other base figures that we can use, or to do a sample survey, but the base is too small, so it did not give us a lot of useful information. Yes, this has disturbed us for a long time. The CCF is already providing some relief, but I agree we should adopt an open mind to see whether there can be another basis for doing the calculations. Right, Dr. Fernando Zheng, please, you only have 1 minute. Please settle down, and then the 1 minute will be for you. Just now, the Secretary has totally ducked the issue. First of all, below the poverty line, about half of the CSA recipients are there. This is not acceptable. If you talk about relative poverty, and yet there should be a way to bring these poor people to a place above the poverty line. Since you have already drawn that line, you should not shy away from helping those below the line. Even if you have CSSA, you have to review whether there is a problem with the CSSA mechanism. At least you should look at what you mean by basic living. If your assistance scheme is not meeting basic needs, you are not helping poor people and their plight. Why can't you do a proper review? He said that he was willing, that he would have an open mind. But they have promised us not just this, but also a lot of data requested by members. Okay, this is the time for this item. This is about an adjustment of the allowance. The administration would go to FC in December to seek funding support. Members, in principle, do you support the submission of this funding request to FC? If you have no other views, I will say yes. Chairman, there is no way we can refuse to support it. Well, this is not a well-established mechanism as such. It is a poorly established mechanism. But anyway, this should go to FC. KK Fong? Well, I think they are hitting us below the belt. If we do not support it, it would be worse than what we have before. So there is no way we can avoid from accepting it. However, almost all members have spoken, queried the basis for calculation. They should think hard about it. Okay, this is a big issue. But in fact, we have already finished the item. But Mr. Wang Yukman, you have just come in. We can give you 4 minutes. Well, I don't care. I don't need to speak because I have no questions. I just like to lash out at some people. So do you want your 4 minutes? Well, of course, if I have them. The thing is, if you ask me to ask questions, then I will respect you. I was taking students on a tour around Lechko. I think that is more important than having a meeting here. Okay, please carry on. First of all, the index. This talks about CSSA standard payment rates and also SSA payments. Such a mouthful that this is based on the SSAIP. In other words, this has a direct impact on the new CSSA payments. I remember some members mentioned that with regard to this SSAIP and the weighted figures, that it should be updated because the SSAIP cannot reflect how CSSA people are affected by the latest social situation. So you should review the commodities and items included in the index, and also the expenditure pattern of CSSA households on indispensable items. When the poverty subcommittee went to Taiwan, we saw how people calculated the lowest income or median income. They would have this item of indispensable expenditure. And also, we are concerned that the CSSA standard payment and the rent allowance are on the low side. I think that has been covered by many members. If you say starting from February next year, there would at least be 3.7% for the CSS, AOA, and DA, we are not happy with that level of increase. Especially with regard to the MRA, you are not catching up with inflation. Rentals are at exorbitant prices. This is common sense, Matthew Cheung. Don't play around with figures. This is so infuriating. You spend so much time. You come here to talk to us. But if we follow your model, we cannot solve the problem of the poor and the low-income group and also CSSA households. Right? CH Tong lashed away or slashed the payment by 11.1%. That was in 2003 and nobody is mentioning it anymore. There was a cut of 11.1% in 2003 and you never made that up. If the CSSA is regulated only according to inflation, you have to try to claw back the 11.1%. That was taken away in 2003. The adjustment this time around is not going to solve problems. And we are looking at how you do your sums. I think we really have to take you to task on one fine day. You have so many experts, so many people in the administration. You're all professional. You should not just be playing around with words and figures. We want to solve problems. Your rent allowance is not solving problems. Do you know how much rent people are paying outside the administration? You have $280,000 a month and you do not have to pay for food or other expenditure. So you are not seriously tackling the problem. Therefore, this annual adjustment of SS payment rates under SSA and CSSA and rent allowance, some people may say this may be something that can be flaunted by 689. No, Longhair was talking about rent allowance. I think he is daydreaming. No way are you going to allow rent control. Definitely, that's something you're not going to do. But in terms of the adjustment calculation, you should be more flexible, meaning that you must align the calculations with social developments. People cannot pay rent with that allowance. I have been to Sham Shui Po and Hong Ham to the SDUs. Do you know what kind of environment people live in? Some people are paying 7,000 to 8,000 for one SDU. Okay, time's up. I'd like to listen to you on one issue. Just now the secretary said, and he promised that he would have an open mind in looking at the calculation basis. And also the director promised us data and figures that we requested. At the FC in December, they will go to the FC for funding support. Do you support this in principle? And you asked whether all the information we asked for should go to FC before you support, or do you say you don't want to support the funding request today? Well, I feel that in principle you want to allow them to go ahead. Is that right? Let us support the funding request first with conditions, of course, that at the FC they should submit all the information we requested at the meeting. Okay, Secretary, this does not mean that we have done that without reluctance. or else we would be in a situation like that for the SMW. Do you understand, Mr. Secretary? You really have to do something about how you can tackle this, because the basis for calculation has been an argument for over 10 years. Okay, so in principle, we support this. Now, we have overrun by half an hour. If you agree, let us extend the meeting to 1 o'clock. If there are no other views, let's go into the second item. Setting up rehabilitation and elderly services facilities in the development project of Urban Renewal Authority at Haitan Street, Guilin Street, Peiho Street, Sham Shui Po. The paper has been submitted by the administration. And we also have a background brief from the Secretariat. We'll invite the administration team to come in, and I'd like to say to members that since this is also a funding request, are you all right, Commissioner? I think he is being rehabilitated. Take your time. The ROP 83A still applies, and I will not go through it again to save time. The administration will be here to introduce the paper. I already read it out, and that is in the URA Sham Shui Po project, the setting up of rehabilitation and elderly service facilities. We'll start. The administration will have 3 minutes, and members will also have 3 minutes only, or else we cannot catch up with the time. Commissioner. Thank you, Chairman. We are here today to seek members' support for the setting up of rehabilitation and elderly services facilities by the SWD in the URA project in Sham Shui Po. We are going to set up a 60-place special childcare center, 60-place early education and training center, a 48-place daycare center for the elderly, and a sub-base for neighborhood elderly center. This will relieve the very keen service demand. The URA project will involve an area of 7,530 square feet. We are going to give land to the URA by land exchange. There will be residential, commercial, open space, and also GIC facilities. The URA will be responsible for designing and building the SWD facilities. When the project is completed, the SWD will take over and arrange for NGOs to operate the facilities. We hope that in the first quarter of 2014, we can sign the land exchange agreement with the URA. The entire redevelopment project will be completed in 2019-2020, and the SWD facilities will be part of the residential development, and these will be on the lower floors of the residential buildings. The SCCC cum EETC would be on the third floor and part of the second floor, and the DE would be on the first floor, so that we can reprovision the YWCA Lam Wu Center. And then the sub-base will be on the second floor, which will also be for the Hong Kong YWCA facility, which is now at Enchao Street Municipal Services Building. According to well-established procedures, we have already got the Lotteries Fund Committee to put aside $40.65 million for the building cost of these facilities. And also in accordance with established procedures, if these facilities involve recurrent allocation of over $10 million, we have first of all come to this panel for support and seek approval of the FC. If members will support the paper, we will try our best to go to the FC in December for funding approval, so that early next year we can complete the land exchange procedure so the project can start. As for the rehabilitation and elderly services, the full-year recurrent allocation would be at $11.54 million, and we have already got the support of the Shamshui District Council. Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner. Now we throw the floor open to members. 6 members are lining to speak. Fernando Zhang, Pun Xiu Peng, KK Fong, Helena Wang, Tan Ka-piu, and myself. Dr. Fernando Zhang, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Placing SCC, EETC, and elderly services facilities together, we always welcome such a proposal, and we think that you're doing it too little, too late. Well, I think the provision of early childhood intervention is disastrous, because you see, the number on the waiting list far exceeds the places in the pipeline. And even you agree that thousands of kids are waiting for such services, and yet every year you can only add an extra few hundred places. Well, in 2013-14, an additional 607 and 1,200 additional places in the coming 5 years. When close to 7,000 are waiting, so this is a far cry from what you can provide. So my question for the administration is, what is your intention? You know full well that thousands of young kids are waiting, and yet you can only add an additional few hundred places per year. So what is your intention? Do you allow the queue to get longer and longer? And for aging in place, it's just a slogan. You're not really doing anything effective. Do you have any innovative ideas and practices? Because if you go on in this way, the queues will only become longer and longer. People feel aggrieved, and unfortunately, young kids would lose their chance of early intervention and identification. You are just cheating people. Thank you. We know that people are very concerned about this, and there was a very in-depth discussion with deputations in this panel not long ago. Of course, at this stage, we'll continue to identify sites so as to continue adding new places. Yes, 6,000 odd kids are waiting for such places. And we have only got reserved sites for providing 1,000 or so additional places. It's true that we have to continue to identify suitable sites. And we understand that the CCF has proposed that for kids waiting for EETC places, well, low-income families can benefit under the CCF using private services. So we intend to regularize this facility or this measure, because 3,000 out of the 6,000 odd kids are waiting for early training and identification. So in the first half of next year, we'll try our very best to make this CCF initiative a regular one. And we will provide subsidies to kids waiting for places to secure private services. Thank you. Mr. Pan Xiaoping. Thank you. According to the commissioner, there will be a 60 place SCC come 60 place EETC, and also a 48 place DE. The URA is commissioned by the administration to provide such facilities. Why can't the administration boost the capacity? And paragraph 4 is about increasing preschool rehabilitation places. Well, according to the paragraph, you continue to actively identify additional sites for provision of more places in from now to 2017-18, you will provide an additional 1,000 odd places. So I'd like to know what is your policy and what plans do you have so that the addition of places or the provision of places can catch up with demand. Thank you. I'll first answer the question on early education and training. And as for UR, the ERA issue, I will ask my colleague to answer. Yes, we know that there is a keen demand for preschool rehabilitation places. We have earmarked sites for providing 1,300 odd additional places. We know that there is still a big gap. We continue to identify additional sites, and we know that among the 6,245 kids waiting for rehabilitation places, 3,000 of them are waiting for early training and education. So CCF is already providing subsidies for these kids to procure private services. Next year, we will make this a standing provision. As regards facilities to be built by URA, may I invite my colleague to answer? Bureau. Yes, we've maintained a very close liaison with the Development Bureau to see how many facilities can be provided in URA programs, but we have to balance different factors and also the site constraints and the demand for such facilities in that particular district, the views of the public and also the district council. So we are already trying to fight for the greatest number of sites from the lands department, and after very thorough consideration, we decide that such facilities should be placed here. Mr. KK Fong, I don't think the question has been answered. Of course, you have asked, but the question is how can you achieve the results? The question is, the queue is growing faster than the pace you provide extra places. Well, if people have to wait for 3 years, it is already unbearable. But now we know that the queue is very long. For URA, all their sites are in the urban areas, so you can just disregard what district these facilities are in. You ask the community, they all need such facilities. You can calculate on a territory-wide basis wherever the sites are. People can always access there for facilities. So you should require URA and also PRH program to provide such facilities. Well, many government offices, buildings have a very vacant forum. You can ask them, or foyer, you can ask them to give up the space for providing such facilities. Mr. Wu? Thank you for your views. We will continue to discuss with the Lands Department and Planning Department and fight for the greatest amount of space for provision of welfare facilities when there are new developments. The SWD has spared no efforts in negotiating with relevant government departments. However, very often we have a number of factors to be considered. The demand or the competing demand from other government facilities and other things. So we have been liaising with relevant departments, and we've been trying to fight for opportunities in new developments. Can you commit that the increase in new places will always outstrip that of increase in demand? This is just a direction. Of course, This is our target as well as ideal. But in reality, we really have a lot of difficulties in identifying sites, and that's why we are changing the mode of service delivery. For instance, the measure by CCF will be made a regular one. We have to address the problems before we can really increase. We can ensure that the growth of places can outstrip that of the growth in demand. Dr. Helena Wong, I have a question on paragraph 4. According to the paragraph, there are currently a total of 6,245 preschool rehabilitation places, and under Note 1, places provided by SCCS, EETCS, and integrated programs in kindergarten cum CCC are included. But you haven't given us the numbers on integrated programs in kindergarten cum childcare centers. Can you tell us the number of places available under this category and also the waiting list for such services? Because Annex A doesn't tally paragraph 4, because you're talking about the provision of places in the coming 5 years. There will be 1,000. According to the to paragraph 4, there will be 1,200 additional places. I'd like to know whether these places include all these categories. Well, the table hasn't included integrated programs, because usually for integrated programs, kindergarten cum CCCs will just add a few places. There are 1,860 places in integrated programs, and the waiting list is about 1,492. And the waiting time is around 13 to 17 months. So we have not included integrated programs in our statistics, because usually such places are added in kindergarten cum CCCs. So we plan to invite ordinary kindergartens and CCCs to offer more integrated places. Thank you. Paragraph 4 says that in the coming 5 years there will be an additional 1,200 places. So this has not taken into account integrated programs, right? So you will provide additional 120 places under this project. Has it been accounted towards this year's additional places? No, it should be beyond the 5 years we talk about in paragraph 4. So the 120 additional places under this project are not included in that 1,200 additional places. Of course, we are very concerned about early training and education. However, I am quite concerned about the NEC sub-base, because you have 4 extra places, and the 2 places are 1 MTR station apart, one in Changsha, one in Samshui Po. And what will be the impact on the existing service users? Will the users find it difficult to access the new center? And we are happy to see an increase in the average space per capita for users. Can you tell us the historical track record in this regard in the past few years? And what about the NEC in Lion Estate? How are you going to use that premises? Well, reprovisioning of DE. we will ensure that there will be resources we'll have transport resources for elderly users, so there won't be a major problem. And for all new DEs, we will ensure that there is sufficient provision of space for Light On because it's been used for a while, and therefore whenever there is new site available in the district or if premises are vacated, they will be enlisted to make up for the shortfall in space. Regarding Light On Estate, if a few years down the road is going to be vacated, what will be the future use? Well, nearer the time, we will make a decision depending on the needs of the community and whether other centers can make use of the premises. We will make good use of valuable space. Will you ensure that this reprovisioning will not affect adversely the service users? Certainly not. It's my turn. So I'd like to know how are you going to use the Light On site?
I can see 142 square meters, and I believe you can create another 20 daycare places, meaning half an institution. But if you make no decision now, if you think about it only in 2020, there will be another delay of 2-3 years because you have to seek funding, or you can have a 15 plus 15 SCCC cum EETC. Depending what you want to do, well, we can discuss this paper in that kind of ratio with you. In other words, 20 elderly places or 15 plus 15 early training places for children. If you don't think about it today, but only in 2020, these will be vacant, left vacant or idle for another few years. And then the NGOs might not be happy to release the space. They can say they can continue to operate non-subsidized, non-profit services. And then you would again lose over 1,000 square meters in providing services. This is because you do not have early planning, so you are not making proper use of the spaces. And then in para 11, you mentioned the sub-base, but then in Annex 3, you do not provide extra funding for manpower to that NGO. I believe the sub-base will certainly be open for the users, and yet if you do not provide extra manpower to it, then they probably cannot operate two bases at the same time. We have discussed this for so long, but if you look at Annex C, you do not give them any extra manpower resources. So are you going to increase personal emoluments resources? Or if you're not going to do it, then can they keep the doors closed instead of opening it for 8 hours, 12 hours on a daily basis? You are talking about two services. First, DE. It will be moved to Hoi Tan Street in 2020 from Light On Estate. We agree with you, Deputy Chairman. We are not going to do planning in 2020. We'll do it a few years before. If we know the exact completion date of the Hoi Tan Street project, we will do the planning 2-3 years before that, and how we are going to use the vacated premises at Light On. We will do it in a scheduled way. First of all, it will certainly be subsidized services first. So rest assured, if there are people needing subsidized services, we will not just assign the space to the NGO to operate self-sustaining services. Secondly, the NEC. The one at Hoi Tan Street will be a sub-base. In other words, the NEC will be operated separately in two places. This is quite common for NECs or district centers for the elderly. In terms of resources, we would regard it as one NEC. This is the fact. As for opening hours, the center will discuss further with our headquarters. Now, I cannot promise that it needed not be open to residents, because residents would query why it is not properly lit up to provide services. Rather, the arrangement of services can be in such a way that their members can visit the sub-base when activities are operated or conducted. I think that can be discussed. I think this is due for a review. I'm not only talking about Haitan Street, because I have heard many people say that you are depriving them of the rightful resources. Dr. K.K. Kwok, 3 minutes. Chairman, I support the application, but I have a question about rehabilitation. There is a very small quota. As you know, in Sham Shui Po, we have many low-income grassroots. Now that you have the training center, are you going to reduce the quota? And also, even if you have the new center, how many more families would be standing in the queue? And when will you propose another project to include such rehabilitation centers? 3 questions, please. Mr. Fong. Number 1, with regard to preschool education, children would come in and then they would leave the service. When children are 6 years old, they would be going for mainstream services. Therefore, it is very difficult to estimate now how the 60 new places will help the situation. It's very difficult to do the projection. Plus, there will be changes in the population of preschool children. However, I can give you some information. As Mr. K.K. Fong mentioned, in the district now, we don't only take care of the queue in Sham Shui Po, but also in the neighboring districts. As you know, transportation is very convenient now, and I can give you the information. In Sham Shui Po, we have 479 places. These are the existing places, not including the new 60. And 274 are for SCCC and 205 are for EETC, and there are 325 in the queue now. Therefore, if you look at the district, then we are already taking care of demand. However, if you look at Kowloon West, that which includes Yau Chim Mong, and given the convenience in transportation, we are looking at also dealing with the demand from districts around Sham Shui Po. And I can also give you the information. In Kowloon West, we have 921 people queuing up for the service. So basically, the 60 places which will be available 5, 6, 7 years down the road will be for Kowloon West. Therefore, it is very difficult to make an estimate now how many people will still be waiting. And in the next 5 years, there will be an increase of 1,200 places. 2/3 are for EETC and 1/3 for SCCC. These will be completed in the next 5 years. A very short follow-up, please. You talked about Kowloon West with 900 people waiting. Even if you have 60 new places, you are not going to meet demand. As we said, the CCF will be regularized, and we should not only just provide these places. We don't know whether these places will come to pass because that depends on a lot of factors. Therefore, we are thinking of different ways to provide the service once the CCF will become a regular arrangement. In the past few years, we have already served 2,100 young children who were waiting for our services. Or you are talking about the board service. Second round, one person, just 1 minute because we have already exceeded the time. Dr. Fernando Zhang, Mr. KK Kwok, actually, if you look at Sham Shui Po, we have 4 EETC, and we are already talking about waiting until March 2015. And if you look at Mongkok, they have to wait 2 years instead of 1.5 as in Sham Shui Po. And if you are talking about early childhood training, we are talking about the golden period in which training can be provided. However, the CCF is not going to help medium level or high level mentally handicapped children. Even for private services, people are waiting on end. They don't know how long they have to wait even for private services. This is already a disaster. You must go for revolutionary thinking. If you just go on practicing what you have been doing, you are not going to solve the problem. Okay, I think the administration has heard you. This item will go to the FC for funding support. I'd like to ask members whether in principle you would support the submission of the item to FC for funding approval. No objection. Right, okay. We think they are not doing enough. That's all. Okay, next item. Setting up a new contract residential care home for the elderly and a daycare center for the elderly at Tuen Mun Tang Lot 499 ex Kwong Choi Market, Tuen Mun. The administration team is already here. I'd like to remind members that, again, this is a funding request that will go to FC. I'd like to draw your attention to ROP 83A and the Declaration of Interest Requirement. Thank you. Administration introduction first. Because of time constraint, you would only have 3 minutes. Yes? PAS? Thank you, Chairman. This paper seeks members' support for a construction project proposed by the SWT in Tuen Mun, which is at the ex Kwong Choi Market site at Jiang Choi Street and Cheng Min Path in Tuen Mun. We are going to build a 100-place contract residential care home for the elderly and a 60-place daycare center for the elderly. In paras 6 to 8 of the paper, we said that the old site has been included in the 2013-14 land sale program to be used for private residential use, and there will be conditions in the land sale agreement to stipulate that the buyer of the site will have to be responsible for building the contract RCHE and the DE. We expect to be able to award the contract in 2021-22, and the proposed services can also come into effect in the same year. We have already released the land sale conditions, and we have already consulted the Environment, Hygiene and District Development Committee of Tuen Mun District Council with regard to the land sale conditions. In paras 9 and 10, we have told members the financial arrangement for building the RCHE and the DE. As before, the fitting out works and the construction works, as well as the furniture that would be funded by the Lotteries Fund. In July this year, the advisory committee has already put aside $69.92 million for the construction cost. As for fitting out and furniture purchase, etc., that would be applied for near the completion of the project. Our estimate is that the RCHE and DE would incur about $15.7 million in recurrent expenditure. As the previous item, since the recurrent expenditure exceeds $10 million per annum, we need support from panel members before we can go to FC for funding support. If members agree, we will also go to the FC in December for funding support. That is all for my introduction. Thank you. Okay, the floor is now open for questions. We have Tanka Pugh, KK Kwok, Tam Yu Chong, Helena Wong, and Fernando Zhang in the queue. 3 minutes each. Tanka Pugh.
Chairman, I support the paper. However, I have to leave early because I have another meeting. Well, I think last year's first Welfare Services Panel meeting, we discussed a similar issue, and that is, I think, in Tin Shui Man or Yun Long railway station, there will be a similar project. And well, how come, just like the last project, we have to wait for 10 years? Of course, day one, the contract is approved. Elders cannot move in. So can you move faster? I've been using the Tong Chong complex as example at Mentong Road. In early 2006, funding was sought from FC, and then the date of commissioning 2013. So it only took 7 years. So how come for this you're going to take so long? And the under Annex 5, you have got a breakdown of the 60-place RCHE. Well, dementia supplement, $347,000 per year. So are you expecting that 60 out of that 60 users of the RCHE will all suffer from dementia, or is it just an estimate? Mr. Wu? Thank you. First, about the time taken for an RCHE. Well, the whole welfare facility is incorporated into the residential development. So the milestones are included in the terms of land sale. And usually the staff would give regard to a number of factors in fixing the dates. For instance, the requirement of the welfare facilities, the area, so on and so forth. Now, from execution of the lease, it will be 6 years. The deadline is 6 years for the facility to be commissioned. Now, if we take into account the time needed to invite eligible NGOs or organizations to operate that RCHE, we expect the center to be commissioned by the fourth quarter of 2022. Yes. It's true that last November we came to this panel on similar projects. There were 11 new development projects. Now, if you compare or if you read the table carefully, you can see that some of the projects already included in the list on readily available services. Now, for this Chen Choi Street project, where it was not included in last November's plan. This is because in the past year we have been trying to secure sites from various government departments. So you see that for some facilities, they will be coming on stream gradually in the coming few years. Well, for some of the items included in November's list, they will gradually be commissioned. What about the question on dementia supplement? Well, for DE, when we calculate the requirement on dementia supplement, we have a certain ratio. So in the DE, the ratio is smaller. So are you projecting that all 60 users will be suffering from dementia? Of course not. It's just according to a certain ratio. Dr. Kwokaki, it is impossible for us to object to such a project. We're only regretting that the government is doing too little, too late. Close to 30,000 elders are waiting for places in elderly homes, and they cannot this cannot be satisfied by ordinary elderly homes. Now for this site, if you maximize the plot ratio, I'm sure you can provide more than 150 places or 160 places. So why can't the administration use the whole site for GIC? Why only 160 places are provided? I don't know whether the administration has tried to fight for more places. Why not 3,200 places instead of 160? Well, in Tuen Mun or Yunnan or Tuen Mun in particular, this will be the only new facility available in the coming 7 to 8 years. So how come the administration has not fought for more places on behalf of elders in this site? Mrs. Chen, thank you for your views, Dr. Kwok. As you said, the number of places seems not to be too many in this site. This is because we are under a big constraint because for elderly homes they cannot be over 24 meters above the ground. All right, the building itself can be very tall, but we cannot use the premises on the 5th floor or above for residential homes for the safety of the elders. So this is a constraint we face. And please refer to Annex 3. In the coming, we have 11 sites earmarked for the construction of RCHEs. As the Assistant Director said, there will be regular updates to the table. We keep trying to identify new sites and they will be included as appropriate. So for 3 sites, they were not included in last November, but now they're included now. Where necessary, there will be new sites included. This 24-meter restriction, when was it first fixed? Because nowadays fire safety installations are much advanced than it was in the past. So why can't the administration review this restriction and relax the height limit a little bit? And I'm sure when you have sufficient FSIs, people will not object. Do you have time to respond? We've just discussed with the FSD very recently. In last July, we just reviewed this requirement. We understand that FSIs or firefighting devices have advanced, but according to the FSD, these elders living in RCHEs are not as mobile as we are, and they have to be moved out when there is a fire. And FSD is of the view that the 24-meter height restriction is needed, and we do have this requirement in place for our RCHEs. How about I deal with the time first? We have 4 more in the queue, so I don't think we have enough time if we end at 1. So why don't we extend it to 1:10? Mr. Tam Yu Chong and Dr. Helena Wang. Well, I think it is a good practice for the administration to include such requirements in new land sales. Of course, that would mean some land premium forgone. But anyway, I also thought perhaps more places could be provided. Now I understand that there is a height restriction. But I remember that when this item was discussed in the Tuen Mun District Council, district councillors also wanted more facilities for children and for the youth. So I don't think these clients have as strict height restriction requirements. So can you consider using the floors above for child and youth services? When we have a site we will not just consider the need of elderly services. We will consider the demand for all sorts of welfare facilities in the district and set up a priority for allocation. I'm afraid I don't have the information with me now. Perhaps my colleague from SWD can supplement. Thank you, Mr. Tam, for your comments. When the Two Moon District Council discussed this issue, it did say whether other commercial or community facilities could be housed, such as services for children and for the youth. And what the Chang Choi Street government building has got a service center for young people, and nearby there are also facilities to serve women and also child care centers. So in determining the use of the Guangdong Scheme market site, there was no consideration to provide facilities for children and young people. Well, since the district council said so, of course there was such a need. However, the facility would only be commissioned in 2021, 2022, so people have to wait for a long time. Dr. Helena Wong. Thank you, Chairman. Well, Mrs. Carrie Lam announced the population policy consultation document not long ago, and there was nothing in the report on services for the elderly. She claimed that there were already policies to take care of the elders, but because of the aging population, for sure you will see a rising demand for RCHEs, and the waiting time will also continue to rise. I would like to know the government's policy on the provision of RCHEs. Yes, it's very good that you've already earmarked 11 sites for such purpose. But what is your policy? Do you go and look for sites and then see how many places you can provide, or rather will you do it the other way around? Will you look at the growth in the elder population in the coming decade and the expected demand for such places, so as to arise an indicator for the extra number of places to be provided every year, and then you go out and find the sites to provide the places? I have the feeling that the addition of places will be constrained by the availability of sites. I don't see how the provision of elderly homes can serve the growth in the aging population. Now, this is a good policy. You make use of for instance, market sites or a URA project. And in Kuaishing Estate, you have also got PRH estates, where the lower floors are used for all sorts of welfare facilities. So will you have the indicators first, and then you go to discuss with the Transport and Housing Bureau and even the Food and Health Bureau, and ask for space to be reserved for provision of such facilities in the future? Please allow time for the administration to respond. Mrs. Chen. I think we have answered the same question many times before. We do not just rely on a single approach. We identify new sites for construction of new homes, and through the bought place scheme, we also increase the supply of subsidized places. Yes, we have a very keen demand for places in RCHEs, but I think members understand that we would like to improve the conditions for the elders to age in place. so that the frail and weaker elders can be taken care of in the way they like best. So whether we talk about URA projects or PRH projects, well, we have got many of these sites among the 11 proposed here. Yes, we have heard suggestions that we should set up indicators. Yes, we will consider so doing. Dr. Fernando Zhou. Yes, the time to build a home is far too long. Very often we have to wait up to 10 years for a facility to be provided. Well, for the South Island line, it was gazetted in 2009, and then work commenced in 2011, commissioning date 2015. So it all depends on how fast you want to proceed. For elderly services, you take your time, and yet for infrastructure like the South Island line, you've been proceeding so speedily, even though you have to overcome land resumption problems.
If you call this a time-honored mechanism, I think this is actually a laughing stock. And you also ask the NGOs to be self-sufficient for 40% of these joint projects, and actually the self-sustaining places cost about $10,000 excluding sundry items expenditure, and some bed spaces can cost $17,000 to $18,000 a month plus miscellaneous expenditure. It is about $20,000. So grassroots elderly people cannot wait for a place before they leave the world. However, the rich ones can always get a place. This is far from ideal. I'd like to ask you that actually your places that are built by yourselves should be fully funded by government instead of having contract RCHEs whereby some of the places are going to be self-sufficient. AD, with regard to the self-sufficient part of contract RCHEs, in the tenders, the bidders have to propose the amount involved in the self-sufficient quota, and a mark will be given when we assess the applications. I believe it would not be, as Dr. Fernando Zhang said, that the self-sufficient places of these RCHEs would fetch such a high fee. It depends on the location of these contract RCHEs. I myself know that some in Kaohsiung, under the self-sufficient quota, the bidders will calculate a figure complementary to the situation in that district or region. Therefore, I don't believe there are people who are in dire difficulties but who cannot get a place in the contract RCHEs. Chairman, I think she should take a closer look at the contract RCHEs. I have looked at the websites, and like characters, Lei Hao Wo, CNA Home, the cheapest place would be over $10,000 and the most expensive $17,000 excluding miscellaneous expenditure. Okay, my turn. I would pick up where Dr. Fernando Zhang left off. It is now 6:04. Basically 40% for self-sufficient places. I don't care how the RCHEs set the prices. Let us say 6,000, all right? But compared to subsidized RCHEs, which cost only over $1,000, the difference is very big. And low-income grassroots elderly people can only stay in the queue, and then they can never get a place in the self-sufficient quota. And in Central and Western District, I can accept 40% being self-sufficient places. But if this is in Tuen Mun, you are making it difficult for the institutions. Those who cannot make the payment will have to go to Tuen Mun. I don't know whether $10,000 is the average price, but I believe 8,000 is already the lowest. I was quoting 6,000, but I was really joking. In NT West, do you expect elderly people to be able to pay $8,000? So you should review the ratio. Should it be 6:4 or 7:3 or 8:2? I believe it was 9:1 when we first had this. The SWD has to give us a reply as to whether you would be able to adjust the ratio. And then I like to mention that I have the feeling that the SWD is waiting for the construction to be completed before you call for tenders. In fact, we know the construction completion date. You should do the tendering exercise half a year before completion. So you should start renovation once the building is completed. Another project, you say you would commission the surface in July this year, that it was commissioned, but then I would tell you that actually the building was completed 5 years ago. So AD, can you talk about the ratio 6:4, whether it can be 7:3 or 2:8? Yes, we can consider that, Chairman. But I remember when we came here last November, members were very keen about the date for calling tenders. We have already promised that we would compress the time schedule, and in fact we were able to do it. As Mr. Chan was saying, if we can compress it by half a year, we can shorten it by half a year. We are going in that direction. Okay, no more second round. And I'd like to ask members here whether you would support in principle that this project can go to FC in December. Members, any objection? If not, we would support the funding request. AOB, we have nothing. Under AOB, meeting is adjourned. Thank you.